Welcome to the Bagel Logic Podcast, the show where Papa Tom spreads wisdom like a smear of cream cheese on an everything bagel. Here's your host, Thom Jennings.
Hello and welcome to the Bagel Logic Podcast. This week's topic is for job hunters and anybody who's had to go through an interview process for a job, whether you've been through it in the past or plan to go through it in the future. Before we begin, though, I just want to say a special thank you to everybody for tuning into the first episode, which was How to Fail at Business. And I received some great feedback, some wonderful messages through Facebook Messenger and text messages. And I when you start a podcast, especially like this, where it's just some person talking and rambling and, lecturing, you always have to worry about whether it's going to resonate with people. And it really, as I mentioned in the last episode, I think in my case, and I'm sure in other people's cases, you deal with a certain level of insecurity. And it's really wonderful when people take the time to reach out to you and say, hey, I really like this. There were some things that resonated with me. And even if you find something in here that you disagree with, that's okay. And I think as a society, we've moved to a point, kind of a sad point, where if people disagree, it becomes, you get kind of territorial when it comes to your opinion. And I'm like everybody else. I mean, there's certain things that I have a very strong opinion on, and I do become very territorial and defensive. But we learn from each other. We learn from each other's opinions, even if we don't agree with them. At least the ability to understand what other people are thinking is an important skill. And those are the types of skills that as a nation, as individuals, that we really need to develop. So with that being said, if there's something that I say that's you disagree with, that offends you or whatever, please feel free to reach out to me. And I'll do the best I can to address it. I mean, I'm like anybody. I can be sensitive and sometimes take things wrong, but I can take a fair amount of criticism. I know I'm not perfect, and I've always felt that when it comes to somebody expressing an opinion, that an opinion is offered for people to consider. It shouldn't be offered as fact for people to just say, well, this is just the way it is. And that's not to say that opinions aren't supported by or contain factual information or revelations of some sort. But again, they all have to be part of the kind of the greater topic of whatever we're exploring. So in this case, we're going to be talking about job interviews. And my hope would be, from the entertainment perspective, like if people listen to this and maybe hear some of my interview horror stories and some that weren't necessarily horror stories, but kind of funny stories, that they'll find some things that they can relate to that are entertaining. And, or it may just be someone who's in a job hunt right now, this is a weird time to be looking for a job. Let's be honest. And they can find some information in here that'll be helpful for them during their job hunt process. And, the interview it's just, to me, it's always been one of the oddest parts of looking for a job. And I don't want to say that I necessarily have a unique perspective, but I've done a lot of interviews over the years, at least in the last, I think it's 14 or 15 years that I've been writing a newspaper column for the Niagara Gazette. And most of my interview subjects are musicians and occasionally some comedians and other types of entertainers. So I've been an interviewer, and as an interviewer for the media, it's a very, very different approach, because you really are just trying to get to know some information, and and you hope that maybe you make some kind of personal connection. And it doesn't happen very often, although it does happen on occasion, which is always an exciting part. But the job interview is more of it's kind of a dance. I would say that an interview with a musician is it can be stressful, but for the most part, it's comforting. And really, as the interviewer, you are the conduit to the people that are reading your columns. So you're trying to get information that would be relevant to everybody who would potentially read or want to know more about a musician. Whereas in a job interview, for the most part, the process on the employer's end is to kind of reaffirm what they're seeing on the resume, determine if there is some kind of connection between the employer and the employee. And I think that the big thing is always, how the person reacts under pressure, because they always throw some kind of wacko question at you. And, I'm one of those people that when I was knee deep in the interview process, I would always try to anticipate what questions that the interviewer would do, like which ones that they throw at you. Because there's always a few that you can anticipate. And the one that was to me that was the most cringeworthy was, tell me about a time that you and a coworker had a conflict and how you resolved it. And it's like, my brain would go to a place where I would think about this just horrific conflict that I had with a coworker, and it was usually solved with something that was very sophomoric and anger driven, like I'll just never talk to that coworker ever again. And then that way they can't ever say anything to the boss about any interaction that we've ever had. So, dealing with other employees, which will eventually be a subject of another Bagel Logic podcast. And I think that really the overarching theme of what I envision in the Bagel Logic is this, it's about relationships and developing them and kind of becoming introspective in looking at yourself and your piece of the relationship, the part that you can control. But that question isn't necessarily designed for you to be brutally honest. And in fact, if you're brutally honest, you probably are going to get yourself into a bit of trouble. And I've had situations where brutally honest in a job interview has backfired. So, or I don't even know if it was necessarily brutally honest, but I was interviewing for this one position that was that paid significantly higher than the one that I was working at the time. It was in the mortgage industry, and I had spent all this money, dressing for success, and I had this perfect outfit and spent, my last dime looking perfect. And from what the recruiter told me later, the reason I didn't get the job was because the interviewer asked me the one of those other questions that you get all the time. Where do you see yourself in 5 years? And that's a difficult question too, because if you're too aggressive, like I was, because I said to him, well, in 5 years, I'd like to be doing what you're doing. Now, the interviewer took that as me saying, oh, so you want my job? So I got to worry about you coming into my company and gunning for me. But the reality is that I had answered that question in the way that I thought that they wanted to hear it, because I thought that would make me sound ambitious. And there was a degree of truth to that. I mean, who wants to go work for a company? You get hired. I think of like the restaurant industry. So I get hired as a dishwasher. Where do you see yourself in 5 years? Man, I'd like to be scrubbing pots and not just doing dishes. So you to me, like if I got hired for a company, and especially if I was hired at an not even necessarily an entry level position, but even if it was a manager level or whatever, I want to get promoted. Like I mean, titles mean something to me. They always have. And, and that's difficult. I mean, that's honestly one of the things that I've struggled with the most in terms of being a school teacher, because once you're a teacher, the next step is administrator. And the only way you can become an administrator is to go and get more education. And I'm at a point in my life where I'm like, nah, not getting any more education to become an administrator. But any other job that I had, I mean, it was something that I wanted to, my mindset was, well, I'll get in, I'll prove to them how amazing I am. And of course they will recognize that. and the world will be my oyster. I'm not even sure what that expression means. My mom used to use it all the time. So back to that interview. So I was looking for this position. It was a startup company. I just couldn't get an interview for the life of me. And I finally went back to some of that old school approach and decided, well, you know what? I'll give them a phone call. They seem to be advertising every week that they're looking for people. And the appeal of the position was I had actually been teaching for 7.5 years and burned out. Then I went into community-based social work, and that didn't work out, and found myself unemployed due to, a number of crazy circumstances. And my unemployment's on getting to the point where it's running out. And my mindset was, you know what? The problem is because the teaching position I had was not a public school teaching position. And this is important because it kind of gets you to where my headspace was at the time. It was with a not-for-profit agency, and they had frozen my pay for, I don't know, 7 of the 7.5 years. I think we had one raise 6 months in, and then that was it. I was getting to the point where I just couldn't pay my bills anymore. So I shifted to this community-based social work position because I thought that it would give me some flexibility to pursue some other side hustles and give me some more flexibility. And I actually took a small pay cut to do that because they said that, oh, you do this position, I think you have the skill set and the education to get promoted. So, back to what I said earlier, coming into a position where I wanted to be promoted to manager at some point. And I wasn't even the one that put that out in the interview process. It was the person that interviewed me. Well, that didn't work out. And there really wasn't a promotion out even possible for me. So I was frustrated, and I decided to look for sales positions because I figured with sales positions that if you get a sales position, you get paid based on your productivity. I mean, and it's interesting. I love, you look at the verbiage in employment ads, and a sales position usually says unlimited income potential, which makes it sound like, wow, I could make $1 billion. I suppose in theory you could. But even like a lottery ticket, the scratch offs, there's a certain amount you're going to make. You can't make much more than that. So I wanted to get into sales, and I'd been in sales, and I succeeded in sales in terms of I can sell. Sales is one of those jobs that really requires two things. You have to have the ability to connect with people, and you have to have the ability to, to close. And it really is a relationship type driven business, sales. It sounded very clunky, but believe it. I think you know what I mean. And in terms of, really, in reality, in terms of being a closer, closer's the person that, in sales, it's an important skill set. You can be a great setup person. And I think my son will tell you, because we worked in sales together, that my real skill was in the setup, just getting to know people, opening the door, having conversations. And honestly, it's because I like people. I love talking to people. I love learning about them. I love hearing their stories. I enjoy it. So that aspect has always come easy. The uncomfortable aspect is trying to get them to do something, to act. And I can appreciate that because I'm one of those people that's very hesitant to act on things as well. So in this case, the interview was a sales position. So I called them up and I said, hey, I've had this application in with you guys for quite some time, and I've noticed that you run this ad every week and nobody's calling me. And I just really want an opportunity to interview. And I think that if I have the opportunity to interview, that you'll see I'm amazing. But so they said, yeah, sure. Oh, we found your resume. Yeah, we'll come in, said day, said week. And then, so I get there And this guy comes in, and he was one of those real typical sales manager types. Very, you could just tell, just reeks of type A and really expensive cologne, perfect attire. Everything fits and is tailored and wonderful. And a watch that probably costs more than they're going to pay me in a month. And he's looking at the resume, and he's looking at me, and he's looking at the resume, and he's looking at me. And I'm sensing something's kind of off here. And so he's like, Thom Jennings? I go, yeah. He goes, well, I got this picture on your resume. And he turns it around to me and he says, is this an old picture? And I chuckle. I said, oh no, that's my son. We have the same name. It's like, oh wow, I guess that explains it. I said, yeah, he must have applied here a while back when he was getting out of college. But you still have my resume on file, and I'd really like to interview for the position. And he says, well, I'll be honest. I don't know if this is something that you'd necessarily be suited for, or something that you'd really like. And then this was the person that we wanted to interview. And I looked at him and I says, well, if you like that resume, you're really going to like me, because I'm the one that made the guy that made that resume. And eventually they hired me. The job didn't work out though. So, and it kind of goes back to the setup at the beginning of the show and what how you measure a job interview. So if the job interview was measured in terms of my ability to think on my feet and answer questions in a kind of funny way, or figure out a way to get through the interview and get hired, then I guess that's great. But the job itself I wasn't really suited for the job. And I only worked there for about 4.5, 5 months. And I look back on it now, and there's, when jobs don't work out, everybody comes up with a stack of reasons, and they're valid. And it goes both ways. It's not always entirely the employer's fault or entirely the employee's fault. It really comes down to that, that phrase, fit. Is it a good fit for you? Is this position a good fit for you? And I think we, as a society, we don't necessarily see the warning signs in the interview process, which is really where you're going to be able to determine fit or not. And this is easier said than done when you're in a position of desperation. So if you don't have a job and you're interviewing for a new job, you're going to be looking at it through that lens, because it's like, I need a job. I can't afford to be picky. Some people pull that off. It always amazes me. I talk to individuals who will be like, well, I didn't take this job because I just don't like it. Well, you must not need the money, because let me tell you, when I need money, I'm just like, when can I start? I mean, that's the thing. But either way, I mean, in the case of this particular position, even though I really needed a job, I think that one of the reasons that it didn't work out is because ultimately they didn't want to hire me. They wanted to hire my son. And the good thing that came out of it is that when I started, so I was really the only young or old guy that was working amongst a bunch of young coworkers. I mean, they were all people that were out of college. So that was the type of workforce that they were looking to build. And I don't fault them for that. I mean, I think there's people that can say, oh, that's age discrimination, but there's certain jobs where age definitely comes into play. I mean, if you're going to discriminate against somebody specifically because of age, I mean, that's wrong and it's illegal. But let's face it, there's certain jobs and certain companies, they want to build themselves up where they have a certain criteria that they're looking for. I mean, like, this may not be a great example, but like a football team, you're not going to hire a 60-year-old guy to be your quarterback unless his name's Tom Brady, I suppose. But so I came in as an older worker, and I did fairly well. I think I did well for them. I didn't do well for me. I was very frustrated at a lot of aspects of the job, and then just continued to look for another job. But they want to bring in a bunch of people behind me that were my age, because evidently they decided, people in their 40s are actually really productive and can do this type of work and are good workers and dependable and whatnot. So that's the positive, successful part of that particular interview. But on a personal level, it really does go back to, you have to think about looking for that early warning sign in terms of whether you are being you, whether you can be you, whether the potential employer wants you and your particular skill set, or it's just not going to be successful. And in that case, it wasn't. And I had another one. It was kind of a stranger, probably the strangest interview process that I ever went through, was for a executive director position at a not-for-profit. And this one has always stuck with me. And it was funny because one of my jobs I work at, I still bartend, and it's a Saturday night. I ran into one of my former coworkers from this place last night and realized, man, this was 7 years ago. It's like, wow, time flies. But even 7 years later, there's still, it's one of those scenarios that kind of, in situations that has really stuck with me, and to the point where it's still very vivid, and in a good way and in a bad way, mostly a bad way. But notwithstanding how the job turned out, the interview process was absolutely fascinating and probably crucial in terms of personal development. And that's, again, we're looking at in terms of the job interview process and how it can be used as a form of personal development. And it can. So the situation with this place is that they were advertising a position for an executive director. Now, let me tell you, I see a position that says they're hiring for executive director. My eyes light up because I'm thinking, man, that is one heck of a job title. I mean, that's a nice thing to put on your business card, isn't it? And it was actually my mother, may she rest in peace, who said, oh, this would be a great position for you. I looked at all the different things that they're looking for. You've done all these things. And God bless my mom. I mean, she was my number one fan. I miss her so much every day. And I remember this conversation, and it warms my heart, because when you lose somebody, it's kind of nice to go back to those fond memories of your mom and how she tells you how much she loves you and has so much faith in you. And she really had a lot of faith in me when it came to applying for this position, more so than I did. But yeah, I was like, dang, man, executive director, that's a pretty cool title. And it was a small not-for-profit, so it wasn't, I knew the pay wasn't going to be great. In fact, the pay I was in one of those, at this time, I was in very much a backwards motion in terms of pay. I kept taking jobs that were paying a little bit less than the previous, a little less, which is funny because the one job I left because they didn't give me a raise for years, and then I got frustrated and thought, I'll go and make my own raises by applying for other jobs and getting jobs that pay more. So here was one that paid less. The good news is I've gotten out of that awful cycle. Trust me, don't get into it. It's horrible. It's horrible. But this position, because it had a great title, executive director, I looked at the pay. Pay was okay. I mean, it was one of those pay levels that I could live with. The commute was super short, so it was local. It came with a little bit of that kind of local prestige too, be one of those guys in the community that was looked up to and part of all the big things that go on, and you'd get press coverage and things like that. So there were so many aspects of the position that appealed to me. And I applied for it and did an admirable job in terms of carving, taking my resume and positioning myself as somebody that would be a good fit for this particular position. But the problem is that I came to find out in the process that I would be interviewing with the board of directors, and on the board of directors was a person. He was actually the president, who in his previous employment, in his previous life, he was the executive director of a significantly large organization that I had worked for. And it was an organization that I had worked for and had left. I mean, I'd quit the position. I'd only worked there for a couple of years, but did not leave on the greatest of terms. It was a situation where, I was dating somebody that I worked with. It was my boss. So that was a pretty dicey situation to begin with. She and this executive director had all kinds of issues. So I got caught up in that, and it was just a hot mess. And all I could think of is that this guy's going to remember that situation and going to be like, yeah, there's no way in heck I'm going to hire this guy. I remember the crap that we went through with him when he worked for the other agency that I headed. But there was, I think, if I remember, 13 or 14 years separated from those incidents. So I thought maybe I'd get away with it. So I applied, interviewed with a phone interview. Phone interview went well. They threw me some of those weird questions, and I walked through them and wasn't really sure if I was going to make it to the next stage. Then they hooked me up with the previous executive director. He and I went out and had coffee, and he gave me the lowdown of everybody on the board. And he's like, there's this one guy, you have to be careful. He talks really slow, and it almost sounds like he has some kind of speech impediment, but so you have to be really patient, let him finish his sentences, and this is what appeals to him, and then this guy likes that. So, this dude set me up. He gave me the whole lowdown on everybody on the board and their quirks and the things that their buzz points that they're going to be looking for. So I felt pretty good. But, I still had that thing about the guy finding me out, thinking, oh yeah, putting two and two together. It kind of goes back to, I think, that our own egos. We think that people think and remember things about us that they just don't. That really drives me crazy. I have former coworkers that I'll run into, and they were people that made a really strong impression on me, and they have no clue who I am. And I automatically think to myself, man, how did I not create an impression on that person? I must be very bland or boring. And, it's just, as you get older, you kind of realize the reality is that people are caught up in their own lives, and things that we think of that are just so huge to us and that we think the whole world is watching and looking at our failures and like we're some kind of celebrity. The reality is that there's very few people that notice. And I think human nature is such that people don't necessarily want other people to fail. They don't. Everybody likes a good success story at their core. That's human nature. But as individuals, we're always attracted to stories that come out poorly because in some ways it makes us feel better about ourselves. Well, at least I didn't do that. That's the whole appeal of like Dr. Phil. You look at everybody on that show and you go, well, hey, I may not have been the greatest dad, but at least I was there for my kids, as opposed to this drunk guy who's spending all of his kids' inheritance on drugs. But I digress. So I go to this interview process, and I made it to, the lunch with the former director, or the cup of coffee with the former director. Then I had to interview with the board. So I interviewed with the board. And this dude set me up perfectly because all the things that he said, all the nuances in terms of what was going to be happening in the room with them, it was all there. And one of the things that they were really looking for is they were looking for somebody that had a background in public relations. And I had this company called Crony Media Group, which if you haven't heard the first episode, go back and listen to it. And I looked at so I put it on my resume that I'd done public relations work, which I did for a festival, and it was an honest thing. I definitely embellished it to make it sound like I'd done a lot more public relation work than I had, and I certainly wasn't great at it, and it wasn't my strongest like quality, or quality is not the word I'm looking for. The word is in my head somewhere. It was not my strongest attribute. There it is. See, when you get older, those words just get stuck in your brain. And then eventually they come dislodged. I should ask Prevagen if they want to be a sponsor. So the guy says to me, he's looking at my resume. This gentleman who was part of the board. And he says, the thing that I'm looking at here that I'm most impressed by, and this was the dude I was warned to let him finish his sentences because he spoke really slow. And I mean, he spoke really slow. And he says, I notice your background in public relations. Could you speak to that? And I looked down at my resume and I'm like, sure. Because the scene was, I probably should have set up the scene. I'm in this boardroom, and makeshift boardroom. It wasn't like any of these high power things. It was just in a like, almost looked like they set up in a janitor's closet. But, a couple of tables cobbled together and everybody's standing around the table. They're sitting and I'm standing at the end of the table getting grilled all these questions. And at this point, I thought I was doing well. So the public relations question comes up and I looked down at my resume and I said, sure. And then I noticed that instead of public relations, the resume says, it's missing an L. So the word is, instead of public, it is pubic. And I am aghast, thinking, oh my gosh, how the heck did I screw this up? But, in the age of spell check, pubic's a word, so it's not going to get picked up by an autocorrect or any kind of spell check. So it's on my resume. And I thought maybe it's in one spot because I knew that I put it in two spots on the resume. I put it up in the summary of qualifications and then in the job portion itself. I thought, well, maybe it's just in one spot. It's not in the other and I'm safe. And it was in both. Like both times I typed it, I'm thinking, what is going on in my brain that I just didn't catch that? I must have read this stinking resume over 1,000 times. So I'm like, well, what do I do? Do I make a joke out of this and go with it? Or do I just pretend that we both see the word public and not pubic? And I chose the latter. I just worked through it and they never picked it up. So then later, these guys take me out for lunch and the president of the board, and I'm terrified at this point. I'm thinking, oh man, through conversation, he's going to figure out who I am. And we made it through the lunch. He doesn't ask. Eventually they hire me. Life is good. And then I get fired the Friday before Christmas. Then I'm back to unemployed. Life is horrible. And it was a really bad Christmas. So what's the lesson learned there? Well, it really goes back to what I was saying before in terms of the whole foundation of the interview and even of the job process was so, in many ways, so disingenuous on my part. I mean, I had no business applying to work for these people knowing that the person who was the president of the board was who he was, because frankly, I didn't have a very high opinion of him. I had a very bad experience with him. And he, what's interesting is we wound up getting to know each other. At least I thought while I worked for that not-for-profit agency. And I thought, oh, he's really not that bad. But it turned out that, yeah, he was everything that I remembered him as. And one of those people that's very beloved in the community. But, if you're on the good side, you're on the good side. If you're on the bad side, they're on their bad side. People have different relationships with different people, and some of them are excellent. Some of them are very poor. I've had relationships with people that have been incredibly strong for a period of time. As long as I agree with them and they agree with me, we do well. And then if there's a disagreement, they don't like that, or if they're not in control of the situation, and the relationship dissolves. Sometimes it's on my end, sometimes it's on their end. But, if you know that you've had an issue with an individual, or you have some kind of a moral problem with that person, you probably shouldn't be applying to work for them. I mean, it's not going to be a good ending. And in this case, it wasn't. And even the whole, as quirky and kind of silly as the whole pubic instead of public relations on the resume may not seem like it was a huge deal, it's something I still think about every day. And it was a mess up and a big one. I mean, in some ways, I thought, as bizarre as this thinking may be, like, why would you hire somebody that's going to run your organization that can't even check their resume for a huge spelling error like that. I get that people make mistakes, but if I was sitting on the board and I picked up that spelling error and I'd be like, yeah, we can hire this dude. He's an idiot. He doesn't pay attention to detail. And that's not necessarily the case. I mean, I did pay attention as much as I thought I did. And those kind of spelling errors are fairly common because, you see the word as you wrote it. And for some reason, this guy saw the word as I intended it because maybe of the context of the sentence or whatever. But and even the job itself. I mean, I was just drunk on the concept of having this title, executive director. It really meant a lot to me. And I don't want to completely exonerate the employer because the employer treated me very shoddily, and there's a whole nother backstory with that I don't need to get into because we're already about 30 some odd minutes into this particular episode, so we got to wrap it up. But I hope if anything, the takeaways, the bagel logic, if you will, the things that are important for you to think about in terms of relationships and job interviews is it really comes down to the same thing. It is that foundation of authenticity, of honesty, not only to yourself, but to everybody around you. If you're going to present yourself to a potential employer, you should present to them the employee that they're going to get. That doesn't mean you need to be brutally honest to the point where if somebody says, what happened at your last job? Well, my boss was a jerk and I told him to F off and I stormed out. I mean, the thing is, you can still tell that story in a way that's like, well, you know what? It was a position that was just not a good fit for me. I just decided that I needed to move on. Yeah, you're leaving out some of the details, but at the end of the day, people can kind of figure out when jobs are good and when jobs are bad. But you don't want to lie. You don't want to lie to yourself. You don't want to lie to the potential employer because it's eventually going to come back to haunt you. And you're always going to be in a position where you just go back to that. I mean, I said I was spending every day working at this place going, man, when's the day this guy is going to put two and two together and figure out who the heck I am? And I don't know, even to this day, I don't know if he ever did. I mean, I still deal with him on a very, distant basis, but, our paths cross and we have mutual friends and all that kind of stuff. But either way, my current job, and this will be the final point, my current job, I knock on wood, I mean, I'm going to my 2-year anniversary. And the thing is that interview, I'll never forget. It was one of those interviews where I didn't need the job. I had a job already and it wasn't horrible. I mean, it wasn't great. This job paid more money, but we sat around in a boardroom and we kind of cracked jokes and there's some self-deprecating humor, and it was very conversational. I felt very comfortable at the beginning, and I didn't have to lie about anything, and I didn't have to do a dog and pony show or tell people what my greatest weakness is. And I'm in a situation where my current boss I don't really have conflicts with them because that's the foundation of our employment. We're honest with each other. And I hadn't had that in a very long time. So I hope that if you are, again, in this particular economy, looking for a new job, that those are the kinds of things that you can consider if you do need to change employment. Don't take another job because you're just so angry and mad at your current employer that you'll take anything. But spend the time and see if you can make that personal connection through the interview process. If the employer cares about you, they'll take time with you during the interview. And you should reciprocate. You should care enough about them to research the organization, to send a thank you letter at the end if it is an interview that you really enjoyed. And I think that in the long run, you'll be a better person for it. And I feel that I'm a better person on some level because of the boneheaded things that have happened through many of my job interviews and all the lies and the resumes that were altered and all that stuff. And I was finally able to get to a point where I could be comfortable enough in my own skin to just say, if I'm going to get a job that I'm going to like, then I have to be honest to everybody. And I have to work for an employer that's going to be honest too, that they're going to tell me what the pay is. They're going to give me the real expectations of the position, all of that kind of stuff as well. Because it's the same thing. If you're told one thing in your job interview and then you do the job and it turns out to be something entirely different, that's could be a topic for a whole nother episode. But anyhow, thank you so much. I appreciate it. We've got some interesting topics, I hope, coming up soon. And I will continue to crank these episodes out as soon as you listen. I'm very happy with the amount of listens that we had on the very first episode. So hopefully we continue to get that. Any questions, anything like that, feel free. I'll put my email contact information in the show notes and fire me off something. Or I've started a Bagel Logic Facebook page that I haven't quite started to promote yet, but we'll do that. You can certainly message me through there as well. But just want to thank you for listening. And a final thank you, which I know she'll never listen, but thank you to my wife for buying me this wonderful Zoom PodTrack P4, which is what I'm recording this on, and in my lovely music room in Oakfield, New York. All right, and this is Thom Jennings with Bagel Logic, signing off. Thanks again.